All right, you are looking live, 28 Pittsburgh Street, in the heart of Columbiana, Ohio, the nicest place in America. Wow, what a privilege it is to be here with you all. Anybody other than Mackenzie and I and me that are excited to be here on a Monday morning? Who's excited to be here? Like genuinely, you are. Wow, sweet. All right.
You both raise your hand. We raise it louder for us. We didn't like that.
All right, here we go. You got it right. I started off by asking Elise about President Kennedy because second period, hardly anybody really knew anything. Mrs. Tosh, I figured out I'm officially old when we have reached a group of kids that really don't know hardly anything about the Kennedys. Kennedys are like one of the most well-known, most talked about presidencies really of all time because President Kennedy came to the White House at a time where television and this idea of mass media taking over our culture. In fact, his election is tied to television, which we'll get to in a moment. Does anybody know what the F stands for in John F. Kennedy? And because his name is John, what? Who said that? What'd you say?
Derek said it.
No, I didn't.
What'd you say, Derek?
I didn't actually. No, I didn't actually.
I thought I heard it.
No, I didn't say it.
Fitzgerald. Hey, I'm so glad you're happy to be here on this Monday morning, but calm. Hey, you're done with that quiz already. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Democrat. However, some of you that you've heard of Kennedy and you're up on these things, Riley. You may have heard people say if Kennedy was alive today, he'd probably be that's what some people think. Because his views even back then, Scott, were considered more moderate Democrat. For instance, when it came to the race issue, the two issues that you've learned about that have been going on in America post-World War II are the Cold War and race, segregation, right? And desegregation. Kennedy was of the mind that, desegregation is needed. That was not that popular in the Democratic Party. It's just a fact, especially those Democrats in what part of the country? South, right? So there's that thought that he would be maybe a Republican today. That's kind of a sign of how much our culture, how we have let actually, when I say we, I mean the church, and I really mean that. The church has allowed the secular postmodern type thinking to overcome and overwhelm even our thinking, right? The election of 1960, a very significant one. It's John Fitzgerald Kennedy against Richard Milhouse Nixon. We'll touch on Nixon for a minute here, but we'll learn a lot more about Nixon because some of you might also know that he will be president one day. Just that this day is not going to be his day. It's one of the closest elections in history. Now, you guys, you've gone through, some of you don't remember the election of 2016, some do. You definitely don't remember the election of 2012, but 2016 and 2020, you might be thinking, well, aren't all elections like this? No. 2016 and 2020, it was deep into the night, or in 2020, early into the next morning where people were getting an idea who was going to win because there was so much suspense. That's not normal in presidential politics. The election of 1960 was one of the closest in history up to that point. It's still one of the closest in history, but it was kind of weird, strange, unique. The last two elections we've had make it seem like the election of 1960 is no big deal because of how close those have been. Everybody caught up? So this is that website 270 to win. Little synopsis of the election. If you just peruse what it says there. By the way, before we get to Kennedy, why didn't Eisenhower run again? He was very popular. Why didn't Eisenhower just run again? He was a very popular president. He got elected as a popular war hero through his term. American economy is doing great. Why didn't Eisenhower just run again? Why did Nixon run for president instead of Eisenhower? Yeah? Right. He's the first president that legally wasn't allowed to run again. The 25th Amendment had been passed, if you remember, and that kept anyone from ever doing what FDR did again, because the feeling in the country was FDR amassed way too much power. That's not the intention. George Washington served 2, and that's the way it was, unwritten law, and FDR made it so that it had to become a written law. Okay, so this is one of the closest elections, as you see. Also in this election, which made it closer probably than it needed to be, but maybe it didn't really have that much of an effect because the Democrats won anyway. Nixon wasn't going to win any of the South. But just like in 1948, when Truman had to overcome a fractured Democrat Party, Kennedy has to overcome a fractured Democrat Party. You see here that there's actually 2 Democrat candidates. There's Kennedy, and there's a guy named Harry Byrd. Byrd won 15 electoral votes. Deep in the South, okay. Now, when I show you this map at first glance, who's it look like won? Red or blue?
Red.
Who said blue? I mean, it's kind of close. Look at all that. West of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, look at all that red. Now, there's a major blue state. This state right here. This is a big deal. Kennedy chose as his running mate, his vice president, a man named Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he was from Texas. Texas is a big piece of the pie, right? Texas actually ends up being a very close election, and it goes Kennedy's way. If it didn't, that would have been a big deal. This one was very close too, but this is the big piece because it's part of, look, Nevada kind of stands out there. California was close too, but here's something interesting. Still, 1960, there's still 2.5 times as many people living in Ohio than Florida. Does that seem strange to you? Anybody? Like, have you ever thought to yourself, man, especially when it's March 27th and there's snow on the ground, or March 28th and there's snow on the ground, like, who would live in Ohio? Anybody ever had that thought? Oh. You're not gonna live here? Where are you going? South? Right. So a lot of look, Mississippi, Alabama, how really relatively low the population is in these states. Arizona. What's the least number of electoral votes a state can have?
3.
1?
Yeah.
3? Who said 3? Why?
That's the lowest number I've seen.
That's true. The lowest number a state can have is 3. Remember, it's based on population, but the lowest number you can have is 3 because each state has 2. Each state has 2 senators and at least 1 representative. The representative is based on population, right? So you get a electoral vote for each of your state representatives, 2 senators and at least 1 representative, right? So that tells you that, it doesn't tell you that the population of Alaska and Hawaii are the same. And it doesn't even tell you that there's almost as many people living in Alaska that there are in Arizona, because that would be really weird, right? Yeah? In 1960, there's many, it's not that close in population. It's just the fact that you have to have at least 3 based on the way the electoral college is set up. 2 senators, 1 House of Representatives. Any other interesting things you see there? Any other comments? This is the election of 1960. Notice the blue in the South. Blue for Democrat. The Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, were, the general idea there was they did not want to give in to this idea of what is starting to really grow, the civil rights movement. They did not want to give in and be forced, whether it was because they were racist themselves, or there still is an argument to be made. I put that facing out again just to make a point of it today. That book that says the South was right. Some people get unhinged about seeing a title that says the South was right and having it be in a classroom. What is that about? Well, do you think the authors of that book are racist and believe that slavery should still be? Spoiler alert, they're not. What do you think the point to that book is? The South was right, with the Confederate flag symbol on their cover. It's supposed to be a title that you go, what? What do you think? What do you think the point to their book is? Yeah.
The government can't just say
What government?
uh,
What part of it? What level government? The national government. That according to our Constitution, the national federal government really doesn't have the right to dictate, mandate what states do. I keep making that a point to you, because so that someday maybe we can get back to the basics and the fundamentals of our country and the founding of our country, so that as most people look at polls show today that most people think we're heading in the wrong direction, well, maybe if we get back to our foundation that led to the greatest, most prosperous country in the world, maybe we can turn things around, because it was never intended for Washington, D.C. to be so much part of our lives. Anyway, this is based on the fact that they either are very racist or sticking to the principle that the national government has no right to pass laws to tell people that live in Mississippi how they should run their state. Very few instances. In fact, the Constitution lists powers of the national government, and then the Constitution says anything that's not enumerated or listed here goes to the states. That's the way it's supposed to be. If we don't like it, I don't like the idea that these people were quote unquote, until the laws were changed, allowed to treat people like that. But then you had to change it by law, which we ended up doing. The state law, though, what we'd hope is the people that lived in those states would change it, not have to be mandated by the national government. Any other things you see on there? Here's an anomaly. You know what that word means? Something that doesn't quite fit. One of the things you've heard in the last couple elections in 2020 was, if you win Ohio, you're probably going to win the election, right? So this is a very close contested election, and it's one of those cases where, one of the few, where Nixon won Ohio, but didn't win the overall election. Nothing else? Oops. The people watching, they'd rather see what's on the screen than see me, I think. Right? Julia? Johnny? Everybody say hi, Johnny. You know he's on there, right?
what a guy.
Is he actually? He's definitely.
That's the election of 1960. Cold War. The Cold War and civil rights. It's the first televised debate, or debates were the leading up to the election were the first ones ever televised. And I think I have in parentheses there a little back. Yeah, major factor. This was a bigger factor than we would want to believe. If you remember my sad attempt at a joke, because everybody in here knows, especially the ladies, that I am not sexist or misogynist or anti-woman at all. In fact, if anything, it would be the opposite, right, Jake? I favor ladies more than guys, don't I? Right, Jake? So when I make the joke about who got elected in 1920, right after the 19th Amendment, who was that handsome devil? Warren G. Harding. And I make the joke like, oh, he must have been the best. That's not my joke. I just use that as a joke, right? So after the 19th Amendment, which was, what was the 19th Amendment there? 18th was prohibition.
Women's rights.
Elise, what was the 19th Amendment? Women's suffrage, and women had the right to vote. Well, you would hope that something so superficial wouldn't have affected the election, right? Like this guy's better looking than that guy, right? It's an insult to say that, isn't it, Elise? Guess what? The 1960 debate, you had young, energetic John F. Kennedy standing on the stage. This is the first time people have seen this on TV with an older, not so energetic Richard Nixon. And the idea that, hey, most people are going to think that Kennedy looks better than Nixon. Well, if it comes down to 100,000 votes out of 68 million votes, and it comes down to 100,000, that means, think about what that means. That means only 50-some thousand have to change, right? I mean, if the difference between them is 112,000, that means if Nixon got 56 more thousand, that means Kennedy didn't get those 56, right? You ever think about that? Like he didn't have to get 100, he only had to get 56 more thousand votes, and he would have won. Well, you know, some people are so superficial that they don't think very much about politics. You know, there's a lot of people that vote that don't like watch the news all the time. They don't get really into the weeds like I do about all the issues, right? And they just go and vote based on what somebody told them, or hey, that guy just seems better. You know that happens, right? That guy just seems better. He's better looking. He talks nice. He doesn't send mean tweets, something like that, right? They don't really think about what's really going on. So this is a major factor. If you only had to affect like 0.2% of the population or 0.1% to say, I just like that guy better. Maybe because he just looks better. He presents himself better. The first televised debate was a very big thing. So who was this Nixon guy? We mentioned him before. You knew he was Eisenhower's VP, right? And you knew, I think you remember, he was from California. That's a big deal because that's a large and growing state population-wise. So he was first a representative. By the way, that's kind of how it always used to happen. First, you'd be in the lower house. Remember how our Congress is set up? Kind of like the British, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So you'd start off your political career in the House of Representatives because that's considered the lower house, and you can do that when you're younger. And then the Senate's supposed to be a more prestigious, more older, wiser political body. We'll get back to Nixon in a week or two because some of you know he will be president someday. But this wasn't his day. This was Kennedy's day. This was JFK Day. Like Monday. Next one. Right, Jake? He chooses LBJ. Back-to-back presidents that go by their three initials, not LeBron. Lyndon Baines Johnson. From what state? I already mentioned it. Nope. Nope. Texas. The big piece, Texas. A very contested state. Texas today, we definitely consider more conservative, right? And back then, you'd think maybe lean conservative. They needed Johnson because they needed Texas. Kennedy and Johnson, when it came to civil rights, they weren't really on the same page. They needed to make sure that Kennedy swept the South, the blue, on the map. And Johnson was one that could allow them to do that. What does that tell you about Johnson's reputation when it comes to race? Before Kennedy becomes president, he did serve in World War II. So you go back to the Pacific Theater, and Kennedy is on what's called a PT boat. PT stands for Patrol Torpedo. So if you think of what a torpedo is, you're probably picturing a torpedo being shot from what vessel? Hello? A submarine, right? So submarines trying to go undetected underwater, and then torpedoes to blow up ships. Well, this was a patrol boat that had torpedoes. So it was on the surface of the water. And when I see a picture of the PTs, it just looks like someone's got a fancy speedboat, like a pretty big one. If you have family that goes fishing, so they're more that size. And his was blown out of the water by the Japanese, and he survived, obviously. And he also helped other people survive, so he's somewhat of a hero. He gets the Navy Service Medal, didn't get the Medal of Honor, but Service Medal for his time in World War II. So he's a bit of a war hero. And then in 1956, he writes a best-selling book called Profiles in Courage. So how many remember we mentioned a man named Kennedy way back when we were doing the robber barons? And I think we mentioned him during Hoover's, when we were talking about the Great Depression. Remember that?
Yeah.
So the Kennedy name has been known in business and in politics. He comes into this as from a pretty rich family. And then he writes this book called Profiles in Courage, where he's taking kind of the biographies of some of the people in Congress and putting them in book form. By the way, he happens to be one of them. Not that I'm insinuating he did it for self-serving purposes, but he took like a number of the people in Congress and wrote these bios and put them in a book form, Profiles in Courage, to show, like maybe they were a war hero or they did something else great. By the way, he was one of them in his own book. Take for that what you want. But it did become a very famous, well-known best-selling book, and put his name on the political map. Does that make sense? 1956, that's kind of the way it works. Also, if you go back and you track people that became president, they usually didn't just come out of nowhere, right? So Obama, who seemingly came out of nowhere, but really didn't. So when he got elected in 2008, you go back to even 1996, during the Democratic Convention, he came to be known by the people because he gave a speech during that convention, and then it was like, oh, that guy, hey, he seemed like a pretty good candidate, good speaker, and then he didn't become president though for 12 years after. So Kennedy's got his name out there in 56. He's from Massachusetts, if you remember your state abbreviations. You gotta stand on your head. You have to stand on your head. How do you get rid of hiccups? Just hold your breath. Yeah. What is it?
You put your tongue on the top of your mouth.
Tongue on the top of your
You
mouth.
drink
I
water.
think everybody's got
You
different
drink water
methods.
and put.
I kind of just hold my breath.
No, just put your tongue on top of your mouth.
I think that works too.
By the way, Massachusetts, known for being conservative or liberal. Anybody? State of Massachusetts, is that a state that we associate with conservative politics or liberal? Liberal, yeah, very liberal. Boston Boston's kind of a liberal hub for politicians, Massachusetts on the East Coast. California today is a very liberal state. And what city would be like the West Coast capital for liberalism? California City. San Francisco. So like some people might say Boston, San Francisco East, or San Francisco's Boston West. You never heard of that before? If you didn't, now you do. So the fact that he's from Massachusetts, there's already this idea that he's liberal, even though I've already set him up that he's kind of a conservative Democrat. But if you're a Republican, you're very weary of people coming out of Massachusetts. This is a big deal. Not only were the debates televised, he's got this going against him. Should that be something that goes against you? That he's Catholic? Shouldn't be, but it is. No one in America, so we've been a country for almost 200 years. In 1960, he's the first Catholic to be elected president. So now we've had 2 Catholic presidents in all of our years. And though I don't know if anybody in here is Catholic, is anybody here Catholic? I don't think that would be a good or bad thing. Most of us are Protestant, right? And most of America has been Protestant. At least it is, well, I gotta look into that percentage of Americans. Surely Protestantism has been a higher percentage throughout. But there was a time where Catholicism was a much higher percentage than it is today, and still none had ever been elected president. By the way, not forget it. I was going to mention that one of the big, I was like, should I get too political here? But this, you think? When you're Catholics, what political issue do you think they are known for being the most vocal about? Anybody? Nobody knows. The right to life, right? The church's stance on the right to life and the idea that you don't, the country then, and Kennedy being a Catholic would have really had that stance. Biden's Catholic, he says, but he's not, which is kind of weird. Kennedy is the youngest person ever elected president, even though he's the second youngest president. How's that? Okay.
Vice president was made president.
Who was?
I don't know.
Well, it's up there. Kennedy's the youngest man ever elected president, but he's the second youngest president. How's that possible? You have it, David.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt. Whose vice president was Teddy Roosevelt? Ohio guy, well known in these parts. Lisbon, Niles, Canton. McKinley was assassinated, so Roosevelt became president at 43 years, so many days, but he didn't get elected till a few years later, right? Kennedy gets elected at 43 years and a little less days than Roosevelt was, so he's the youngest elected, but not the youngest ever. Does that make sense? And so we got a few things going against him. He's got what we showed you on the map, that other guy that's running for president that got 15 electoral votes. He's Catholic. America's never elected a Catholic president, and he's just too young. How can we elect someone that young? And remember, even if you go back to the turn of the century, Teddy Roosevelt elected in the early 1900s at 40-ish. That's older than 1960s 40. Does that make sense? Like, you may have heard the saying, like, 80s the new 60 or something like that. Yeah. like 80 years old to me. He doesn't seem that old anymore. He's like really old. But even when I thought that was old. Like when Reagan got elected, what? 70 years old? We're electing a guy that old? And now we elect guys deep in their 70s. But wait, there's more. Whoa. Of course, just to add to my grief, it's going to spin on me. Come on. Liberty Bibberty.
It was the first election in which Alaska and Hawaii could both participate. Dwight Eisenhower had a pretty good run, but he was the first president officially not allowed to seek a third term. Enthusiastically sought the presidency. Several Republicans, however, supported Nelson Rockefeller.
Remember that name?
New York and a member of the wealthy Rockefeller family. Rockefeller was the leader of the liberal/moderate wing in the Republican Party. After Rockefeller decided to drop out of the race, Nixon easily won the Republican nomination. But he was a little worried he didn't have the Rockefeller Republicans on his side. So he met with Rockefeller to make sure that they were on the same page on many issues. By doing this, Nixon sort of officially became a big government Republican, you could say. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was Nixon. And also had a bunch of other ancestors who were involved with national politics. The Democrats knew they had to nominate someone exciting to get back to the White House. Many Democrats were interested. Most of them were new to the national scene, but most were just not that exciting. California, one of the nominations, but it wasn't that exciting. Stuart Symington, a senator from Missouri, wanted it, and was a bit more exciting. Then there was Adlai Stevenson, who had lost the last two presidential elections. Not exciting. Wayne Morse, a senator from Oregon, better. Lyndon Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader, even better. Hubert Humphrey, a senator from Minnesota, yeah, kind of got people fired up, but really, there was just one man that energized the Democratic Party far more than any other. John Kennedy. And despite some harsh criticism that he was too young to be president, he was just 43 after all, the Democratic Party won. Even though Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson had their disagreements, Kennedy helped unite the party behind him by asking Johnson to be his running mate. And Johnson drew huge, enthusiastic crowds everywhere they went. Nixon promised to campaign in all 50 states, even Alaska and Hawaii. He probably later regretted that promise, however, after he hurt his knee on a car door and the knee got severely infected. After he recovered 2 weeks later, he stayed true to his pledge, but some historians say he was an idiot for doing so, as he likely just wasted time visiting states he had no chance of winning anyway. Lyndon Johnson helped Kennedy by aggressively campaigning for him in the South. It was actually quite a smart move for Kennedy to choose him as a running mate. Still, several Americans criticized Kennedy for his youth, and just like with Al Smith in 1928, there were plenty of Protestants who didn't want Kennedy, a Roman Catholic, as president because of his religion. Since the economy was strong, Kennedy and Nixon often attacked each other on foreign policy. Live presidential debates were held in the general election. There were 4 of them, and they were all on television, so it was a pretty big deal. On the radio agreed that Nixon won. However, for those who saw it on TV, most agreed that Kennedy won.
Did you catch that? If you were just listening, they took a poll. The people that listened to the debate, they said Nixon won, listening to the men talk about the issues. Oh, this guy had better points. But those people that watched the debate, that's the effect the television.
Why? Many say that Nixon looked uncomfortable and weak. He was sweating and was still recovering from his recent knee injury. He was tired from campaigning all day and hadn't worn any makeup, so his beard stubble showed up to viewers at home. He was rested, tan, and confident during the debate. It's pretty crazy how many agree that appearing on television literally changed the outcome of this election. However, going into election day, it was difficult to tell who would win. Everyone knew it would be close. And therefore, this election became one of the most suspenseful and dramatic in American history. And here are the results. In a squeaker, John Kennedy won, becoming the 35th president in American history. It was the closest presidential election since 1916. How close? Well, in Nixon's home state of California, Kennedy appeared to win by 37,000 votes. However, after absentee ballots were counted a week later, Nixon came back.
So it wasn't just 2020 that was so hotly contested.
Jake made a good point. You said you favored women, but you're the guy who came up with the Tampa Bay Tupperware.